Hi, we continue in Acts 14 after Barnabas and Paul in Lystra have healed a man who is disabled from birth, and now the crowd wants to sacrifice to them, believing that they're Zeus and Hermes. So today we look at the response of Barnabas and Paul to that, and the next time we'll complete the chapter as they leave Lystra and complete their journey back to Syria and Antioch. So if you haven't been following this sequence from 11:19 through the end of a chapter where we are, we've been going over these questions, and I encourage you to watch the introductory video to this unit. We're now on question 14, the second half of it. Here, what is the argument Paul makes to the people of Lystra? What might be at play in the sudden change of having treated them as gods and then stoning them and leaving them for dead? So here's our passage here, and we're going to be looking at just these couple of paragraphs where you see the emphasis on the crowds all around here. And if you haven't followed this sequence, there's a description of Lystra here. This is posted at radicalbible.net, like all the PDFs I use in the Radical Bible sequence here. And where they are here is in Lystra. As you can see, they've come this route, and then they're going to get to Derbe and then turn around and go back. So here's where we are. Let's just jump right into our scene here, starting in verse 14 here. So when the apostles Barnabas and Paul, they were noted as apostles in 14:4, it's still unusual because otherwise the apostles are the people who were with Jesus at the Last Supper and nobody else is an apostle. But here they've twice been described that way. Barnabas and Paul here, the order of naming likely reflects the populace's perception of Barnabas as the higher god Zeus. But it's also the case that we saw Barnabas listed earlier. He was the more senior member of this. In other words, he was a follower of Jesus before Paul was, and he was the one that protected Paul from the first crowd and then found him in Tarsus and brought him back. So although Paul's been the speaker, Barnabas has been the leader between the two, and here they are listed together. But they're collectively responding here. So they heard of it, and the question is, did they hear from a translator, or did someone tell them otherwise? Because they would have seen this wild scene of the crowd coming at them and the priest from the temple of Zeus beyond the walls and the bull and the garlands and all that. And they certainly would have understood there's a sacrifice being offered and that they are somehow involved in that. Would they recognize that they were being proclaimed as Zeus and Hermes? It's hard to know, but a translator certainly would have explained that to them. So their first response is to tear their clothes, a ritual act we often see in mourning, as Keener notes below. The verbs here, the verb for tearing their clothes here, diarizontes here, and the verb for rushed out, which we'll look at in a minute, are paralleled in a mourning scene in Judith 14:6-7, with which Luke is probably familiar, which you can see down here below. He cried out with a loud voice and wept and groaned and shouted and rent his garments. Then he went to the tent where Judith had stayed, and when he did not find her, he rushed out. Although the scene is very different, so maybe it's just a coincidence that the verb for rent his garments or tore his garments and rushed out are in the parallel place there. So rushed out here is the verb expedao. It's only here in the New Testament. It's 9 times in the Septuagint, and it can mean rushed out, but it can also mean to leap out, in that way making them parallel to the healed person who leapt up once he could walk. So they rush out shouting. And before we look at the shouting, let's go back to explore something I didn't explore in the last video here. A further note here from Strelin, who explained perhaps why the people responded to Paul and Barnabas the way they did. He argues, as you can see below, they are not responding to the healing itself, but to Paul's stare and shout. And we talked about the stare in the last video, but not about the shout. He gives these reasons. Generally speaking, one may say that in antiquity, anyone who did something that was not understood or that was considered miraculous ran himself the risk of being looked upon as a god. Well, this may be true of anyone. It was especially true of the stranger, xenos in Greek, and Paul and Barnabas obviously are that. So given 14:15, which is what we're on beyond now, Lystrans think Paul is one of the gods come down to us. They are referring more to his pathe than to his physical form, which is to say his emotional response. Rather than being seen as some kind of incarnation of the god or the god in human form, Paul is instead being seen as possessed by the pathe of the gods, the passion or the inner being. According to Acts 14:9, which we looked a little bit at last time, Paul stares, using atenesis, at the crippled man. The locals see this as something off in Paul, which reveals what they believe to be his true identity as a god or a being possessed by a god. For the loud voice is often associated with divine encounters, as we saw in verse 10. So those are perhaps explanations for how the people interpreted the nonverbal response they experienced, his stare and the shouting. And now here they are shouting again, as we can see down here in verse 14. And they're shouting in Greek to an audience that was just speaking Laodicean, I'm sorry, Laconian, wrong city with an L there, Laconian, local dialect. Would the people also understand Greek? Perhaps, as the parallel I gave last time of indigenous people, say, in southern Mexico and Chiapas, who speak Saltal or other Mayan languages, many of whom speak Spanish, but not all of them do. So we don't know how much Greek would have penetrated, but the fact that they're worshiping Zeus and Hermes certainly suggests that the Greek culture has come over to them. But we can't know, and we don't hear the verbal response from them. So, as my note on verse 15 says, the speech has no Christological statements at all. It foreshadows Paul's speech at 1724 in Athens. What is most unusual here is an appeal to the, quote, the nations to follow Yahweh the Creator, with no reference to Jesus or the resurrection. And the note further goes on here. In context, they're inviting the Lystrians to give up the whole fabric of their lives, that is, the religion of empire which supports their colonia status. As Keener puts it, quote, to give up polytheism was to surrender an entire worldview associated with virtually everything familiar that surrounded its devotees. But my note goes on, he fails to connect it with giving up imperial loyalty that was associated with the gods. And that's where I'd like to go here. Because if we just see this as so often scholars read Acts, the question of Jews or Christians or pagans in the abstract like that, and the question of converting to something called Christianity, we miss utterly what's going on here. What we're seeing is indigenous people who've been colonized by Roman soldiers who've taken over their indigenous area and turned it into a little Rome at a distance and bringing their gods and their rituals with them, suggesting that Laconians are subject to the power of the Roman Empire because the gods are on their side. And what Paul and Barnabas' speech will do here is undermine that completely and substitute that they would be part of what I call the religion of creation by appealing to the Creator and the creation, as we'll see explicitly in our passage here. So that's where I suggest how we interpret this. So, friends covers over Andres, men, and you can see on the right side I address it as it is to highlight the actual text that's being said, even though it's gender specific. Why are you doing this? And we are mortals really misses the point. I have on the right side, we share the same human sufferings as you. And at least to my ears, that's so much richer than simply we're mortals. Mortals suggest we'll die, but we share the same human sufferings. Homeopathes, and this is where the pathe, as you can see there, was what the previous note was suggesting is what the people are seeing that they would share with the gods. Because unlike the philosophical culture of the Stoics or the Platonists, who see holiness and divinity as beyond pathos, which is say apathetic, as we would say, without feeling, without passion. The indigenous people see it as a sign of divinity. And certainly in the mythological stories, Zeus and Hermes and all the other gods get angry and have experienced love and the whole range of human emotions. So that's not the issue, but they share emotions like they do. We share the same sufferings and feelings as you do. And that's what makes a wordplay with the residents thought they were gods in human form using homeothentes as opposed to homeopathes. So they're not just in human form, but they are humans who experience the same feelings. And we bring you good news. So we're just like you. Notice there's no sense of being different by being Israelites, or if you will, Judaioi, which Paul doesn't call himself, but just like you, simply human beings like you. And we bring you good news. And as I was noting, the good news has nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus. Let's scroll down a little bit so we can see the whole argument that he's making here. So he says that you should turn from these worthless things, or literally foolish things, and perhaps, and you can see it on the right side, and perhaps that'll be what triggers the crowd, as we'll see. But turn here, epistrepsein 11 times in Acts, from these foolish things to the living God. And certainly by saying foolish things, it's suggesting that there is no Zeus or Hermes. We're not talking about statues here. They're talking about living examples that they understand that Zeus and Hermes are embodied here in Barnabas and Paul. So we're not talking about statues in that sense of idols as something made by human hands. But they're suggesting that Zeus and Hermes don't exist, but the living God does exist. The phrase living God, theon zonta, is only here in Luke Acts, but 12 times elsewhere in the New Testament. And I can't imagine why heaven and earth, because what's at issue is creation. So the word for heaven, both in Greek and Hebrew, in Greek oranos, in Hebrew shamayim, means sky. Obviously, it's the place as described here that the rains come from. So if you think of heaven as some kind of metaphysical realm that's somehow in the sky, but a place full of souls, Paul would know nothing about anything like that. There's certainly a sense that there's a veil, that there's a realm in which God can be revealed more. That's the meaning of apocalypto, from which we get apocalyptic or the book of Revelation. To lift the veil, in other words, that hides from human eyes deeper aspects of creation in which God and angels and others dwell. But there's no metaphysical sense of another realm here. He's just talking about creation here. So that's why I translated on this side, who made the sky and the earth and the sea, as we see in Genesis 1, which certainly must be on their mind here, and all that is in them, certainly echoing Genesis 1. So in past generations, using the word parokemenos is here only here in the Bible. But Tannehill notes suggesting that Paul thinks he stands at a turning point in history, and in fact he does. What's happening here certainly changed all of the Western world, for better or for worse, as things followed up. But certainly it is a turning point in history. And then curiously here, the New RSV translates for one of the only times ethne here, not as Gentiles, but as nations, which is my point all along. And perhaps this follows if we can imagine that what they're talking about here is Genesis, that this is Genesis 1, and this now becomes the table of nations in Genesis 10 that leads, as a good reader knows, to the Tower of Babel, when the people try to gather together around one language and oppose God that way. But he doesn't go to the negative here. He simply says it allows them to follow their own ways, making a nice Acts-related pun, hodos, follow their own ways. Here it's plural, hodois, but plainly the path of Jesus is the way. It's not Christianity. Sometimes it's called the faith, but it's the hodos, the way. And that also echoes Exodus, because the English word Exodus means the way out, ex hodos. And so the way out here is the way out of a reliance on empire and the way into reliance on the Creator. And here's how he describes that here. And what you can see is a little bit of an ABA chiasm, the God who made the sky and the earth, and here's the sky and what comes from the earth. And in the middle here, the past generations allowed the nations to follow their own ways. So we can see a little ABA pattern there. So notice the signs of God's witness to goodness are rain, good harvest, food, and eternal joy. Not a promise of afterlife bliss or anything like that. This is not, as the Bible is not, something that spiritualizes, which is to say abstracts from material things so you can get to what's really important, some interior spirituality. But plainly what the Bible's been about all along. Can we rely on the Creator to give us what we need? And what we need is food, and we need joy. And that's what he's saying. If you witness creation, you know that God gives you that. He has not left himself or literally abandoned oneself. It can mean to forgive or to let go, but it can also mean abandon. So he's not, or left himself is fine, without a witness in doing good. And the doing good here is only one other time in the New Testament is a single word, agathorgon here, literally meaning to a good work or to do good. And here's the evidence of it. You can know that God is witnessing to the good by the rain and the fruitful seasons. The plural for rain here, hutos, is one other time in Acts, but not in the Gospels or Paul, only a few other times as we can see. But it's common in the prophets for exactly this, for the expression of God's provision. We can see this example from Isaiah. He will give rain for the seed with which you sow the ground, and grain, the produce of the ground, which will be rich and plentiful. And so that's the promise. The promise in the Bible and the religion of creation is not your soul will go somewhere after you escape this terrible life, but that the Creator cares for you and will provide you what you need as long as you're not relying on empire for those things instead. The flesh pots of Egypt get replaced by the manna in the wilderness. So rains from the sky, obviously the rain isn't from heaven, and fruitful seasons. Karpophoros, which literally means fruitful, only here in the New Testament, but once in a psalm and once in Jeremiah, neither of them parallel. The word for seasons here is kairos here, which is the other word for time as opposed to chronos that we saw earlier, the measurement of time. And that's fitting here because although seasons follow a calendar, seasons of one's life in one sense is not about the calendar, but how one's experiencing things here. So what they're experiencing is a time of fruitfulness. And then filling you with food, or literally satisfying you here. And again, empipelon here, only here in Acts, but it's a couple of times in Luke, literally fills your hearts with food and rejoicing. And I want to highlight that because the hearts with joy is not separate here. The heart, filling your hearts with both these things, filling your hearts with food, trophes here, And we can look at it back in 246. They broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. So that was back after the Pentecost situation there, the early part of the community of Jesus' followers. And now he's offering the same thing to them and to fill their hearts with joy. Phrosunes here, and only here in one other time in the New Testament. Notice all the rare words in this short little speech. And yet, do they understand him or not? They don't ask any questions. They continue to do what they were doing. My note below has how quickly the tables turn. Paul cannot convince them that they are not gods, yet in a moment, Jews or Judeans have reversed the crowd's perspective despite the healing. So even with these words, they scarcely, using the word malice, only a couple of times outside Acts, restrain the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Restrain katapausa in here, and you can hear pause in there, which is what it means, as it's often used as a Sabbath pause. So according to a pause. So they scarcely could get them to pause to offer sacrifice to them. So their appeal to the religion of creation has no effect at all. But meanwhile, this happens. And the timing of verse 19 is unclear here. Is this happening at the same time or after? Were they there already? Certainly in this immediate scene, they couldn't have come all the way from Antioch and Iconium, which you can see Pisidian Antioch's up here and Iconium is here. Lystra might not be far, but they didn't just come at a moment's notice. Nobody texted them and said, hey, get down here. So we see Judaioi here, Judeans. As Keener notes, the irony in this scene is hard to miss. Local Jews, Judeans, join with idolaters, his word, to oppose the preacher of monotheism. But is that what it's about? Keener proposes a very traditional way that the issue is idolatry or monotheism. But he never calls them idolaters. He simply says to move from these foolish things to the Creator. So the emphasis in this speech isn't many gods versus one God. It's about the evidence of creation all around them. So it's not just some abstract sense of monotheism. It's turning very specifically to the Creator who fills you with what you need, with food and with joy. So here they come here, epikomai, again, a Luke Acts word and not in the other Gospels, from Antioch and Iconium, and persuaded the crowds, not won over so much, but persuaded. And it's a very difficult situation to know what is it they said, because it leads them turning from wanting to offer sacrifice to them trying to kill Paul and believing they have killed him. Notice how that's parallel, as many scholars have noted, to what happened with Jesus in Nazareth back in Luke 4, when at first they wondered about all the wonderful words coming from his mouth, but when he pointed it back to them, they took him out of the city and tried to push him over the cliff, but he escaped from them. So Paul, like Jesus, was dragged out of the city. We have to at least imagine what was the appeal of these foreigners. These are also strangers, Judeans from other places, coming over and winning over these non-Judeans against Paul and Barnabas. And the only thing that I can suggest that makes sense, although I can't prove this here, is that they're dissing their local beliefs in Zeus and Hermes, much like if a foreigner came to the United States and said bad things about you shouldn't pledge allegiance to a flag or to a nation, you should be pledging allegiance to the Creator. And certainly a patriotic spirit might come upon people who otherwise were listening and respond with violence against people who thought they were dissing their patriotism. So that may well be at issue here, that what's at stake is their allegiance to Rome via their allegiance to the gods Zeus and Hermes. But we can't know that for sure. So what the effect is clear, though. Then they stoned Paul. Lithizo, only one other time earlier in Acts, when the Sanhedrin were afraid of being stoned by the people. So it can go either way. They stoned Paul, leaving Barnabas alone for some reason, maybe because Paul was the primary speaker, and dragged him out of the city, Asuron, as Saul had done earlier, dragging people out of their houses in order to have them turned over. So what happens to him is coming back around. And the out of the city presumably leads them past the temple of Zeus outside the walls where the priest had come with the bull. And supposing that he was dead. And then a fascinating thing that happens here that leads to another article that we'll look at in just a moment. Keener notes, this quote fits well Luke's portrayal of Paul as a model sage. Wounds were also used to point to integrity or heroism, and one who, though wounded, continued to fight could be viewed as heroic. And that's kind of a generic response, but we can see another response when we look at the details. So suddenly there are disciples here. We saw earlier in our scene that Paul and Barnabas are described as apostles. This must mean local disciples, because the next day Paul went on with Barnabas to Derbe, but the disciples stay there. And we see in verse 21 that we'll look at next time, they had many disciples in these other places. So these must be local people are on their side, and they surround them. A Kukosanton here, and that leads Glover to address this in a very interesting sort of way. He reviews options for interpreting the word in action, and rejecting traditional interpretations, he tries this. When humans are the subject, the most common use of the verb kuklao, which is to circle, across all Greek literature is in militaristic contexts, that is, of armies or battalions surrounding a person or group of people. He notes its use in other contexts as well. But he notes a Greek parallel as part of a burial ritual, which suggests the disciples here assume Paul is dead. However, those use a different word. So he finally settles on a quote-unquote ring dance, as found in the apocryphal Acts of John, which, as he says, tells of Jesus commanding the disciples to make a circle, using different words, interlock their hands around him. And then he continues, the term gouros, as used in Acts of John, is almost universally understood with reference to the shapes or boundaries of heaven and earth. The ring dance depicted here may be understood as a cosmic event with Christ at the center of it, singing his hymn to the Father. Then he notes two later documents, the Gospel of the Savior and Dance of the Savior, both present a very similar picture of the ring dance, demonstrating that the Acts of John is not alone in imagining this practice among Christ's disciples. So this is certainly not just a ritual where they're singing songs, but perhaps, as in the militaristic context, they're providing protection for the wounded warrior around them and praying for him. And as a result, he simply gets up and goes into the city. He's like the ever-ready bunny, if that's not too dated an image for you. You can see one there if you don't know what that is, and went on. So we'll continue after that to see how they complete the journey back and what happens before they are called back to Antioch, back to Jerusalem from Antioch, to meet with those there to discuss the question of circumcision. See you next time. Bye-bye.